My name's Chris Retzler. The project's called the Reducing Illicit Substance Use Project, and myself and Mike Doyle, who's also on the call, have been running the project with a large number of collaborators, which I'll come on to later on. So I won't worry too much about the background, as I think that's already been covered. But as Sam mentioned, our project particularly aimed to develop interventions which target that important transition as young people go from primary school or middle school through to high school and then throughout adolescence, so prior to often when they will have encountered drugs. To do that, we said we'd come up with a three-pronged approach, which aims to support young people both in assessing the risks, providing them with relevant skills, and allowing them to make more informed decisions, which we hoped would reduce their drug use overall. So the first prong of that was our educational materials, and that's a universal intervention to be used with young people in schools. We also developed a one-to-one intervention that's for young people who are already starting to show problematic use, perhaps getting in trouble at school, that kind of thing. So it's a structured approach for support workers to offer one-to-one sessions. Finally, we also developed a public health campaign to support these other interventions, but I'm not going to talk about that today just because of time restrictions. And for some reason, my slides are not moving on. One moment. There we go. Okay, so I want to just back up a little bit and talk about phase one, the development, where these came from, because they were new interventions that we developed. And to sort of develop them, we needed to know what had already existed, what had been successful both here and abroad. So we started off with the literature review, reviewing as much about successful interventions as we could find. And we also wanted to involve young people and other stakeholders as much as we could in this process. So we spoke to lots and lots of people, got their views on what they thought was effective, on their experiences of substance use and dealing with people who were using problematically. Now, the problem is when you collect all of this information is you somehow then got to make use of it to develop your interventions. So we use something called the COM-B model. And the idea here is that if we want to change behaviour, i.e. reduce substance use or enable better decision making, we need to make sure that we're hitting all three parts of this. So just to make that a little bit more concrete, the capability element, if we identify that young people are using drugs because of peer influence, we need to provide them with the skills to deal with that peer influence. If we hear that, as we did, that young people are using drugs because they're bored, then we need to provide the opportunity to do other things. And then finally, motivation. We need to provide young people with the understanding of the advantages to not taking drugs and being able to plan futures, etc. And if we hit all of those, then the theory suggests we should have our best chance of changing behaviour. So on that basis, we developed our three interventions: education materials, which include lesson plans, slides, activities, and as I mentioned, are targeted at that early adolescent age, between about 11 and 13. And they're really focused on skills, so things like resilience, decision making, setting goals. And there's a little bit of knowledge about substance use and substances themselves, but not quite so much about that. And our aim here was to be as interactive as we could. We didn't want too much traditional teaching where teachers are just talking at students. We wanted them to be engaged in this process. So you can see an outline of the 6 lessons on the right of your screen there, where we focus on things like peer influence, on interpersonal skills, decision making, goal setting, planning for the future, and then we try and work through those. A one-to-one intervention manual, as I mentioned, is a guide for practitioners who are already working with young people who use drugs. And this is across adolescence. It says here 11 to 16. We've already expanded it up to 18, and we're hoping to do beyond moving forward. And the idea here is really trying to embrace that complexity of why people use substances, whether it be mental health, whether it be boredom, whatever it might be. And so we developed a 7-stage structured session plan, which aims to be flexible but structured, and that might seem at odds with each other. So we need a structure so that we've got something that we can measure, that we can use to train new starters with our partners, but we also need some flexibility built into that. It seemed to be really, really important to the resilience workers that we're working with, the support workers, that their experience can be brought into it, that their experiences with an individual case can change how they approach it. So we've tried to build both into there. And you can see some of the aims of that manual around understanding links with mental health, increasing young people's risk awareness, developing some of those skills similar to the educational materials, and developing a plan to move forward. And then the last point there probably should be the first one, almost one of the most important, is developing that therapeutic alliance with the practitioner that they meet. So phase 2, as Fiona mentioned, was more about some early assessment. For us, perhaps slightly more about feasibility. Can we actually implement them in the real world? What are the problems we encounter and how can we overcome those? So we took our educational materials to some schools in the local Kirklees area up near Huddersfield. And we collected some baseline data, and that was from students around their own feelings of efficacy, perceptions of impact, and also from students, particularly around those COM-B aspects that we'd identified, things like resilience and decision making. We wanted to get that baseline measure. And we then got teachers at our partner schools to deliver our lessons. And to help them with that, they had a written manual. We provided podcasts that outlined what each lesson was about. And the idea was, we know they're super busy, but they can listen to these on the car on the way to work or while they're walking the dog, whatever it might be. And then during the actual session, there were sets of slides and activity worksheets, etc. And then even immediately after the lesson, we were trying to get data in the form of voice notes from students, from teachers, just to get an idea of what they felt worked in the moment and what didn't work, what could be improved. And then we collected our follow-up data, exactly the same as at baseline, to see if we've seen any changes. We also have a fancily named process and outcome evaluation, which really boils down to a more in-depth look at teachers' and pupils' views. So we ran a bunch of focus groups to really try and understand what went well and what we need to improve and how we can actually make those improvements. We also aimed to have some waiting list schools. We aimed for a similar number. And they were just going to collect the baseline data, collect follow-up data, and then they'd be given the lessons afterwards. So findings from phase 2 around this work package. The lessons were really well received. Pupils and teachers really gave us excellent feedback. They really seemed to enjoy the skill development that we're focusing on. They particularly liked the scenarios and discussions that we enabled in class. And the nice thing here was we're actually in line with the incoming Department for Education guidance, which really emphasizes skills, participation and interaction, which incidentally were exactly our aims at the start, prior to this guidance coming out. We found that our intervention was feasible. We could get schools to collect data around it, to deliver the lessons, and it didn't get in the way of routine teaching. So that was a win in itself. And we did see some encouraging increases in things like self-efficacy, in likelihood of them checking fact-based websites, in their perceptions of risk around drugs. But the problem was we also saw that in our control school. Now, I should say at this point, we only ended up with one control school. For various reasons, our other control schools dropped out, which was a real shame. We were never going to be running a full RCT, so I think we've still got really valuable information, and we've learned a lot about how we might retain those waiting list schools moving forward. So they showed a similar increase in some of these skills and in some of these areas, and we don't know if that's because that particular school incidentally happened to have a really excellent PSHE program, or whether we were just seeing improvements at that level of adolescence anyway. So we've got to be cautious with our interpretation of that. So what have we learned? I guess the important part to take from it, we learned from phase 1 to focus on skills rather than just drugs information, and that seemed to go down really well. School involvement and scheduling was always going to be difficult, and we knew we had to be flexible around when they could deliver, how exactly they delivered, whether it was in blocks or whether it was once every couple of weeks, depending on how they already had PSHE set up in those schools. Retention of waiting list schools was obviously a major issue for us, and moving forward when we're running larger trials, we're going to be providing incentives for those schools to keep them part of the project and have more backup schools to help us. We did have some here, but they were unable to help at the late stage that the others dropped out. School compliance with study data collection, so that's sending out our surveys and enabling us to actually collect this data, was really generally very good. A couple of schools did have some problems around this, and we had to send a few reminders and things, totally understandably. And moving forward, I think for a larger trial, we'd embed a researcher within the school just to enable that relationship, at least a morning each week, if not longer. We found teachers sometimes didn't engage with some of the things that we hoped would really help with their sort of busy work schedule. Things like the podcasts weren't actually very useful, so I don't think we'd use them going forward. And some of the feedback was that we need to create some self-contained slides, which enable teachers to, especially if they've just been thrown into the job of delivering these lessons, that they can still get the message across just from the slides. And that's something we'll look at going forward. And they also made some excellent suggestions of how we can improve it, make sure that our materials suit the needs of different learners, with sentence starters and challenge questions, and we're hoping to co-produce those going forward. Okay, just to move on to the one-to-one intervention, I'm fairly short on time. We worked with our partner at the Base, which is a young person's substance use service in Huddersfield, and we trained 7 of their workers with 2 days of training, and then they implemented our intervention, and we were there at each stage to help them if they needed it. All new young people were eligible for the intervention, and it was implemented for 6 months in the first instance. And in addition, we provided clinical supervision from a psychologist. And we were aiming to do a realist evaluation of this implementation, where we'd collect data from young people, but also from staff, to really try and understand what worked, in what context it worked, and who it worked for. And I'll speak about how successful that was in a moment. And we also collected information from peer mentors. So these in this service are people who have been through the service themselves, and are able to provide us with really, really useful feedback. So hopefully a real depth of evidence here for how we can improve our intervention moving forward, and to understand how well it was implemented. So we ended up with less young people than we'd expected, simply because they didn't have many referred during that period, and we only had a very short time for the project. Most of the ones who were recruited came through the universal pathway, rather than some of the more complex cases that tend to come through mental health or youth justice. We had a nice breadth of data from staff about implementing the intervention, and they were really positive about it. They really felt that it was making a difference to young people, but the lack of data from young people themselves means we can't speak to that too much at this stage. There was excellent feedback around the intervention perhaps being too rigid for some of the more complex cases, and that's something we're working on at the moment. The training we provided was considered really effective. We do need to think about how we can tailor it for various levels of expertise, perhaps having the more experienced people providing some of the training to the less experienced. And I think this working in a quite structured way with clinical supervision was quite a big change for some of the staff. And we need to be careful as we move forward how we embed this and allow the time for this to happen and for them to understand that process, and for us. So learning from this second intervention, we learned to certainly build our relationships with our partners was absolutely key. And we've had some fantastic partners in this. They had some concerns, for example, at the start about disengagement from young people if they brought in a researcher who we wanted to interview them. And so we had to be very flexible about when we collected that data and what we're actually able to do with them, because we want good outcomes for the young people as a first priority. The clinical supervision was considered useful by the staff, but did seem to be treated with a bit of caution. And I think just because it was so new to them, and we need to allow more time and preparation to embed that. We had really, at the outset, really tried to make the point to staff that we weren't assessing them, we were assessing our intervention. But I think that still we had issues around that, and they were worried about being assessed, entirely understandably. So I think going forward, we tried to sort of encourage their own ownership of the project so that they really understand it. Again, a little more time would help. You see a common theme here. We've ended up with mostly staff and implementation data, and we need more time, and we're going to go back and continue to collect that young people's data. But I think we've got some really important information now about how we can embed these kind of psychologically informed interventions in the third sector. And we're writing a paper at the moment, which hopefully is going to provide sort of a pathway or a logic model for how people might go about that and can build on that. So that brings me to the end there. I think we've got good evidence that our approaches are feasible. We certainly understand more of the difficulties of implementing them. And I think we also have some really good learning about how to overcome them moving forward. This penultimate slide just summarizes some of the wonderful partners that we've got on the project. I think they're the real strength of what we're doing. And I'd like to thank you very much for listening. These are Mike, who is co-leading the project, and our work package leads in the bottom right there. Thank you very much.